Jumatatu mpaka Ijumaa, moja kwa moja kutoka VOA Swahili, Washington.
Hello, I'm Esther Githu-Ewart. It's Tuesday, December 20th. This is Africa 54.
Protests erupted in London when the UK's High Court ruled that the Rwanda one-way deportations are legal if each case is given consideration first. As VOA's Ndhio details. The House committee investigating the January 6, 2021 violence at the U.S. Capitol has made criminal charge referrals to the Justice Department against former President Donald Trump. It was 3 years ago that Chinese scientists reported the coronavirus, now known as COVID-19. VOA's Steve Baragona looks back at 3 years of deadly global pandemic. All this and much more on today's Africa 54.
A London High Court has ruled that Britain's plan to send migrants to Rwanda is lawful. The court upheld the individual legal challenges of 8 asylum seekers. Ndhio reports.
Judges in London have ruled that Britain's plan to send migrants to Rwanda is legal. It's consistent with the Refugee Convention for Britain to decide with the Rwandan government to send asylum seekers to the country more than 4,000 miles away. The ruling is a victory for new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who made a high-stakes political promise to tackle the record number of migrants.
Well, I welcome the decision of the court today. We've always maintained that our Rwanda policy is lawful. I'm pleased that was confirmed today. And this is just one part of our plan to tackle illegal migration. Last week I set out a very comprehensive approach to stopping the boats from coming to the UK. It's not going to be easy and we're not going to be able to do it overnight, but I'm confident that with the steps I laid out last week, we really can get to grips with illegal migration, because I think what we all want to see and what I want to deliver is a system whereby if you come to the UK illegally, you will not have the right to stay, and we will be able to return you to your own country if it's safe, or a safe alternative like Rwanda.
A Rwandan government spokesperson welcomes the British courts are giving the green light to the deportation of migrants who arrived illegally in the United Kingdom to Rwanda.
Since the first signing, Rwanda has practically been ready to implement this resolution. We have even had an extra 6 months now to prepare. So if tomorrow a plane arrives, Rwanda is ready to welcome them. Of course, today we are still determining how many will come. It all depends on the decision of the English government.
Amnesty International says that the ruling by Britain's High Court to back the UK government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda is disappointing.
Very disappointing judgment from the High Court now, which is certainly going to encourage the government to think that it will be able to start deporting people to Rwanda. We are opposed to that for a wide range of reasons, including Rwanda's own human rights record and its need to address the rights of people who have sought asylum on its territory.
Protesters outside the High Court were disappointed with Monday's ruling.
So we're very disappointed by the outcome today. Obviously, we now need to regroup and consider our next steps.
The first planned deportation flight to Rwanda was blocked in June by a last-minute injunction granted by the European Court of Human Rights, and the strategy's lawfulness was subsequently challenged at London's High Court. Britain plans to send some immigrants who arrive in the UK as stowaways or in small boats to the East African country where their asylum claims are to be processed. Those granted asylum are likely to stay in Rwanda rather than return to Britain. Monday's ruling involved asylum seekers from Syria, Iran and Iraq, and the immigrant support groups Care for Catalysis, Detention Action, plus the Republic and Commercial Services Union, whose members would have to implement the removals. Paul Ndhio, VOA News, Washington.
Authorities say gunmen in northern Nigeria have killed more than 20 people in 2 separate attacks on farming communities in the latest violence to rock the region. Communities in northwest and central Nigeria have for years suffered attacks by criminal gangs who raid villages, steal cattle, kidnap residents for ransom, and burn homes after looting them. Samuel Aruwan, Kaduna State's Internal Affairs Commissioner, says troops have been dispatched to the area to apprehend the attackers. Elsewhere in Nigeria, Islamic Sharia police in the northern city of Kano have arrested 19 young people for organizing a gay wedding. 15 women and 4 men in their early 20s were detained on Sunday at an event center in the city where the wedding was taking place. The would-be couple escaped, but police say a hunt is underway for their arrest. Kano is among around a dozen predominantly Muslim states in northern Nigeria, where Sharia law operates alongside common law. Homosexuality is punishable by death under that law, although the sentence has never been enforced. Tunisian police arrested former Prime Minister Ali Larayeth on Tuesday, according to his Islamist-inspired Ennahda party. The party accuses authorities of trying to divert attention from calls for President Kais Saied to quit. Larayeth, who served as premier from 2013 to 2014, was detained as part of an investigation into alleged participation of the departure of thousands of young Tunisians to fight with jihadist groups abroad. So many as 6,000 Tunisians traveled to Libya, Iraq, and Syria to volunteer as foreign fighters, a number that secular opposition groups say indicates deliberate neglect. Namibia's deputy prime minister is calling on entrepreneurs to develop business activities and required products in the southern African country and take advantage of the investment opportunities in the U.S. and beyond. Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, who is also Namibia's Minister for International Relations and Cooperation, says the just-ended U.S.-Africa Leadership Summit opens the doors of trade between the two countries and the rest of Africa. In an interview with VOA's Peter Clottey, Nandi-Ndaitwah talks about the major takeaways from the summit for Namibia, as well as her recent election victory and what it means for women in the country and the continent.
The takeaway is that we have reached a stage whereby Africa, USA, or the rest of the world, we need to change our attitude towards one another. And the change is a situation whereby we must engage one another as partners and not as one being vulnerable. You know, when earlier on we were talking about development aid, it does not give a balance. But when you talk about trade and investment, the concept of balance has to come in. Because when you are talking about trade, is that there must be commodities that are identified that should be traded, and the same with the investment. And with Africa now having agreed on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, that will really go a long way of Africa engaging with the United States of America in a better balanced way, because there is a vehicle which is guiding us. And that's why you find now, like when President Biden is talking about Africa becoming a member of the G20, G7, you see the balance that is coming in. So the takeaway for Namibia specifically is that there are those who are interested to invest on the critical areas of concern to us. One, we are talking about Namibia to contribute to Agenda 2063, which is the AU Agenda of Industrialization. And for you to industrialize, you need energy. So that is why we really want those who have indicated the seriousness to invest in the energy sector. We want to continue engaging them until we really find a common understanding. Of course, I'm sure you are aware that now the big issue coming to Namibia is the green hydrogen, which is really a focus internationally. And we hope as we go, its implementation will really make an impact in our country.
That was Namibia's Deputy Prime Minister Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah speaking to VOA's Peter Claudy. U.S. President Joe Biden last week hosted a three-day summit in Washington for leaders of 49 African countries. The forum discussed trade, security, climate change, and food security, among other collaborations between the United States and the continent. President Biden says he will support the African Union joining the G20 group as a permanent member. Political analysts say the summit also sought to improve America's presence in Africa amid China's influence on the continent. The African diaspora also participated in the summit, serving as a bridge that understands its roots in Africa while living and working in the United States. Business deals between the United States and African governments, including the private sector, were also made, ranging from technology, infrastructure, and the health sector. For post-analysis on the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, I'm joined live via Skype from Washington by Kwaku Nuama, a professor of international politics at American University. Professor Nuama, welcome to Africa 54.
Thanks for having me, Esther.
You followed the discourse in Washington last week. What are the three top takeaways from this summit for Africa?
I think there are many takeaways, but three that stand out is, one, Africa matters again to the United States after the chaos of the Trump years and the difficulty of COVID. I think the Biden administration, having done very well in the midterm elections, wants to turn the page and they want to reset relations with Africa. The second thing is that the relationship with the West also matters to Africans, because African countries, there was a rumor in Washington that many were not planning to attend this summit. But as we saw, almost everybody that was invited showed up. So that's important. And then the last takeaway is that Africa wants a different sort of relationship with the United States. So that involves the ability to have good relations with the United States whilst also maintaining these options when it comes to Russia and China. Now, Africans don't want to be lectured to. And if you listen to the speech that Macky Sall made, he brought that up, that Africans need to be respected when it comes to making these choices for themselves.
Obviously, the leaders of Africa were invited in advance, so they planned on when to get here, how to get here. But did you get a sense that Africa was prepared to put on the table what Africa needs most at this time?
So it's always hard to coordinate when we have 54 different countries. Each country wants something. But from what we saw from particularly Macky Sall speaking for the community, was able to articulate some of our needs at the large level. So security, cooperations with the United States, trade and U.S. Involvement in Africa's continuous search for development, but also the question of whether Africans can have a chance to make their own policy when it comes to relations with Russia and China. So currently there's a law being passed in the United States. This is Representative Gregory Meek's a bill which will punish African countries that essentially cooperate with Russia. And Macky Sall said, we are not interested in that. We want you to respect us to make decisions for ourselves. So don't tell us who we can be friends with and who we cannot be friends with. So that gives me a sense that there was some type of coordination, but it's very hard to come up with a big, plan that works for everybody. And especially this is also the beginning of a new dialogue with a new administration. As we continue these types of interactions, better coordination may come forward. But as I said, 54 countries, it's hard to agree on everything.
However, we still expect to see something tangible coming out of the continent after this summit. Professor Kwaku, thank you so much for your perspective.
Thank you for having me.
Kwaku Nuama is a professor of international politics at American University right here in Washington. We're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs at our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, a U.S. congressional panel urges criminal charges be brought against former President Donald Trump. We'll explain. Stay with us.
What was accomplished at the US-Africa Leaders Summit? The United States plans to invest $55 billion in Africa over the next 3 years and support a greater role for the continent at the G20 and the UN Security Council. Join me, Heidi Adams, and my guests as we examine America's renewed engagement with African countries on the next Straight Talk Africa.
From around the world. Let's go.
In other news, U.S. Senator Jim Risch, the top Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is requesting a review of U.S. security assistance and cooperation programs in Nigeria, following Reuters reporting on an illegal abortion program and killing of children carried out by the Nigerian military. Zimbabwean Finance Minister Mthuli Nchumbe says the country is proposing incentives to accelerate 1,000 megawatts of privately owned solar energy projects worth about $1 billion. Zimbabwe is scrambling to plug an electricity deficit that threatens to compound its economic woes. A Libyan court has sentenced 17 former members of the Islamic State group to death. The death sentences are for those convicted of participating in the killing of 53 people in the western city of Sabratha and destruction of public property. For the first time in U.S. history, Congress has made criminal referrals for a former president. The committee investigating the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol urged the Department of Justice to bring 4 criminal charges against Donald Trump, including aiding the insurrection. VOA's congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson has more.
And our president won with a landslide. The year-and-a-half-long investigation into the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol concluded Monday after 10 public hearings and more than 1,000 witnesses.
If we are to survive as a nation of laws and democracy, this can never happen again.
The panel of 7 Democratic and 2 Republican lawmakers making a historic recommendation about former President Donald Trump's role in the insurrection.
January 6, 2021 was the first time one American president refused his constitutional duty to transfer power peacefully to the next.
The committee cannot pursue criminal charges, but it did make 4 referrals to the U.S. Department of Justice, recommending 4 charges against Trump.
The committee believes that more than sufficient evidence exists for a criminal referral of former President Trump for assisting or aiding and comforting those at the Capitol who engaged in a violent attack on the United States.
Lawmakers also said Trump should be charged with obstruction of their investigation, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and conspiracy to make a false statement. The last item in relation to Trump's efforts to appoint false electors as part of a scheme to overthrow the 2020 election results.
We understand the gravity of each and every referral we are making today, just as we understand the magnitude of the crime against democracy that we describe in our report. but we have gone where the facts and the law lead us, and inescapably, they lead us here.
The committee also recommended criminal charges for Trump lawyer John Eastman and ethics investigations into potential Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy and 3 other Republican members of Congress.
You don't concede when there's theft.
Trump has criticized the committee's work, calling it unfair and unbalanced. But much of the testimony came from members of his own staff.
If the president had wanted to make a statement and address the American people, he could have been on camera almost instantly.
The final report on the committee's investigation into the attack on the U.S. Capitol will be released to the public this Wednesday. Catherine Gibson, VOA News, Washington.
3 years ago, scientists in Wuhan, China, first reported infections from a novel coronavirus. Since then, the world has developed and delivered 13 billion shots against COVID-19. It is an unprecedented achievement, but it has been tarnished by unequal access. The global program aimed at improving vaccine equity has announced it will narrow its focus to the poorest countries. VOA Steve Baragona has more.
February 24th, 2021, a delivery of COVID-19 vaccines arrives in Ghana, striking a blow for vaccine equity.
We're really happy because they're going to benefit a large number of beneficiaries in Ghana. Ghana is the first country to receive the COVAX vaccines.
The UN-backed COVAX program aimed to help low- and middle-income countries get access to COVID vaccines after rich countries had locked down most of the early supplies. The program struggled to compete for limited doses. After nearly 2 billion shots delivered, COVAX is narrowing its scope to serve the poorest countries. That's in part because 2 years later, there are plenty of shots available. Not everyone is getting them, however, says Duke University global health professor Krishna Udaikumar.
The inequities really are stark and continued. In Africa, only 25% of the population of the entire continent is fully vaccinated, compared with more than 75% in places like South America.
Supply is not the biggest problem anymore. Demand is. People in lower-income countries are not lining up for COVID shots, says Center for Global Development health expert Janine Madan-Keller.
This lack of demand is really a concerning trend we're seeing. The reasons behind low demand, I'd say, are quite complex and multifaceted.
Misinformation about the vaccines is rampant. Trust in governments providing the shots is low, and many people in lower-income countries don't see COVID as much of a threat. Plus, the vaccines took too long to arrive, Udaikumar says.
While there was demand, it was unmet. So it's reasonable now that we're seeing more hesitancy because we missed the time when everybody was ready to accept and take vaccines.
Much of the delay was because vaccine manufacturing is concentrated in a few, mostly wealthier nations. Poorer nations were left hoping for handouts, says Brown University Pandemic Center Director Jennifer Nuzzo.
I think we have to figure out how to make these vaccines in a much more distributed way than we did before, so we aren't just relying on donations. It's clear donations do not work because when faced with a crisis, countries will always choose to prioritize their own populations.
Efforts are underway to build more vaccine factories in Africa, but building them is just the start. How to keep them in business in the long run is another question, Keller says.
Who's going to buy these vaccines, or what vaccines make sense, both from an economic but also from a health perspective for these manufacturers to produce? Where will the money to pay for them come from?
The African Union faces these questions as it aims to manufacture 60% of its routine vaccines on the continent by 2040. The challenge is to build a sustainable vaccine industry that can handle both regular vaccines and the inevitable next pandemic. Steve Baragona, VOA News.
Britain's Queen Elizabeth II died in September after 7 decades on the throne. Her passing was mourned worldwide and the funeral was watched by millions. Henry Ridgwell looks back at an extraordinary period in British history.
Her last duty as head of state. Queen Elizabeth II formally asked Liz Truss to form a new government on September 6th. Her face retained the familiar brightness, but her frailty was evident. 2 days later, on the evening of September 8th, it was announced that Britain's longest-serving monarch died at her Balmoral residence in Scotland. She was 96.
It was a very considerable shock because although had been clear for a few hours that this was almost certain, this was what the nation dreaded to hear.
It was the end of an extraordinary era. She had served 70 years on the throne, appointed 15 prime ministers, and travelled to 106 countries as Britain's head of state. Her death set into motion 11 days of meticulously planned pomp and ceremony, and of mourning across the nation, the Commonwealth and the world.
This kind of feels like it hasn't sort of hit yet. It's just very strange. It's a very strange feeling.
Upset, emotional, wondering what's going to happen next.
God save the King.
God save the King. Elizabeth's first son took the throne upon her death, becoming King Charles III.
To my darling Mama, as you begin your last great journey to join my dear late Papa, I want simply to say this: thank you. Thank you for your love and devotion to our family and to the family of nations you have served so diligently all these years. May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest.
Elizabeth's body was driven through the Scottish Highlands to Edinburgh and then to London. At Buckingham Palace, the royal family offered private farewells. Her body was taken by horse-drawn carriage to Westminster, where the public were able to pay their respects, to mourn their monarch and matriarch. The lines to see the coffin stretched for several kilometres.
I think it's important for us to make this occasion because it's a huge part of history.
The funeral was attended by 18 monarchs, 55 presidents and 25 prime ministers.
I think the way the Queen's funeral was conducted during that period in Edinburgh, in London and in Windsor will be part of Britain's iconography and also that of the Commonwealth. The fact that it was done with such precision, such a brilliant kaleidoscope of colour, and also was so moving.
Elizabeth was laid to rest in St George's Chapel in Windsor, next to her beloved late husband, Prince Philip. King Charles inherited a politically divided country that had lost its much-loved figurehead. His biggest challenge remains keeping the monarchy relevant as it endures family turmoil and intense scrutiny. His coronation is scheduled for May 2023. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, London.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.